G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And dangerous ideas are the topic of today's conversation. I want to help you wrestle with them. I want you to help me wrestle with them because I've been being asked my opinion about them quite a lot over the past week or two. And I thought I would invite you into the hall of mirrors that is my mind as I think about free speech, hate speech, race riots, offensive speech, insulting speech, big tech, Twitter, Elon Musk, online harms, algorithms, social media. This is all coming about because I was invited on to a television show called Q&A, which is a long-running Australian show where panelists answer questions from the audience about either the news or some big issue. And I was sitting next to Australia's e-safety commissioner, which is a very accomplished woman whom Elon Musk calls Australia's censorship commissar because Elon doesn't like her. He doesn't like people meddling in his definition of what Twitter's rules should be or meddling in his definition of what free speech ought to be. And she and I had something of a back and forth, a little stoush about Elon and about online hate speech in the context of the UK race riots. It went like this.
Because we have a broad set of tools that do both, we were able to take action when Wakely happened. If you contrast that with what just happened with the UK riots, where the chief twit was not only insulting the prime minister, but saying civil war is inevitable and fomenting online hate and disinformation that was what was already violent, they had no recourse because they didn't have similar tools. They had to send an open letter rather than to send a formal removal notice.
I mean, wait a second. Things like fomenting online hate, this is where you start getting into, I think, what the questioner is pointing to, which is you're talking about litigating ideas, essentially. We're not talking about incitement. We're not talking about, hey, everybody, I post something on social media.
It was exactly that. It was incitement.
No, it was not incitement. It is not incitement.
Civil war is inevitable and people should rise up.
So you don't think that's incitement?
No, I don't think it's incitement.
Because a lot of people don't agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of people on the left in particular who seem to believe that they've got a monopoly on the truth and who feel quite unruffled about insisting that ideas that they disagree with are beyond the pale. I would simply remind us all that at every point in time, in every place, the majority and the elite always think they're right, by definition.
So I walked away from that exchange feeling like I had not said all the things that I wish that I had been able to say. The French have a term which they call l'esprit d'escalier, meaning like stairwell wit, meaning the great, smart, clever, funny thing that you think of when you're in the stairwell leaving the apartment or the office where you should have said it. I had a bit of that after this. So then I put pen to paper for the Sydney Morning Herald, which is Sydney's biggest selling broadsheet newspaper, and I published that as a follow-up. And in the process of kind of whittling down my ideas into the small bon mots that can be squeezed into shredded up pieces of trees, I had to discard quite a lot of good ideas, which I hope will be useful to flesh out here. The reason this is important, of course, is because the whole question of whether or not we have a landscape that is conducive to solving the problems of the 21st century hinges on our understanding of how ideas can be transmitted. And I don't think it's immediately obvious that the best way to transmit ideas is for Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg to design algorithms or employ people to design algorithms that are maximally sticky and prioritize ideas that inflame us the most, and that is the correct or, optimal terrain of idea sharing. Nor is it obvious to me that having an e-safety commissioner decide what ideas are appropriate to share and what ones aren't appropriate to share is the best tack either. I mean, obviously in most places, in most times, for most people, the problem has not been that they're too free to share their bad or hateful ideas. I mean, the problem has been that they're not free enough to share ideas which powerful people thought were bad or hateful. So how do you juggle that noble, small L liberal pursuit for free speech with the need to presumably figure out what on earth to do about this tsunami of nonsense that is being amplified by social media algorithms? The first thing to say here is that I actually agree with the e-safety commissioner that Elon Musk's sort of championing of free speech is cynical. Here is a man who is suing advertisers for pulling their money from Twitter. I mean, even like libertarians find this galling. There's an op-ed by a libertarian super pro-free speech lawyer in the Cato Institute website, hardly known for its anti-free speech wokeness. Cato is the libertarian think tank. And allow me to quote. This person says, Musk's theory of free speech is those he agrees with should be free to speak their minds, but nobody else should be allowed to criticize or disassociate from them in response. So, I think this is all posturing and showboating. When Linda Yaccarino, who is Twitter/X's CEO, released a video explaining this lawsuit that they were undertaking against advertisers who were boycotting them, she literally wore a pendant around her neck that said free speech. Like literally draping herself in the rhetoric of freedom at the same time as the company is attacking the freedom of others to do what they want to with their money. I mean, if my definition of free speech was big corporations have to give me money, then sure, I'm definitely down with that version of free speech. I just don't think it passes much intellectual muster. And the other area in which I'm very supportive of the e-safety commissioner and of some of the digital rights activists who are pushing back against big tech and Elon Musk is it's important not to think that an algorithmically sort of amplified free-for-all is the same as free speech. How free is speech when the speech that you're looking at, the posts that you're looking at, the social media feed that you're looking at is intentionally curated to be biased towards whatever is going to keep you on that app or website the longest? I mean, there's nothing sort of neutral about the landscape, the terrain, the playing field of conversation on social media. We know what these things favor. We know that they want you to spend as much time on the website as you possibly can. That's how they maximize their advertising revenue. And by definition, you're going to do that when you engage with content. Engaging meaning, either hovering over it for longer and watching it if it's a video instead of swiping past it, or liking it, or commenting on it, or sharing it. And those activities are, by definition almost, done towards content that either reinforces what you already believe or demonizes what you don't believe. I mean, it's not content that you're going to feel neutral about, right? Which means that content that pushes sort of nuance or empathy or understanding is less likely to please the algorithm than content that has you punching your fist in the air and going, yeah, right on, or I can't believe that they said that, or this is ridiculous, or this is an outrage. So, as I've said many times before, the problem with social media is not that it only shows you things that you like. I mean, there's obviously a lot of stuff on there that you see which you disagree with. Dead Gazan babies, for example, not something that most people like, not even Jews, believe it or not. But the problem is that it will show caricatured cartoon versions of things that you don't like, and it will show the most generous version of the things that you do like, which creates these silos and these echo chambers that are very difficult to escape from. I'm as subject to this as anybody. It just so happens that my entire career and life is guided towards ruthlessly trying to extract those biases from myself, or at least recognize them so that I can proactively act against them. And that is not a calling that most other people share. So yes, I mean, if I were, I was asked on this television show, what would I do if I were the grand poobah of the world about social media? And in some ways, I'm far more radical even than the most radical anti-free speeches, in the sense that I just don't think that we should have invisible black boxes in this space. I think that when it comes to artificial intelligence and algorithmically selected content and recommendations and that sort of thing, we should require the governments of the world, the people of the world, should require tech companies to open up the hood and let us look inside and understand what the algorithms are doing, so that digital activists and journalists, not necessarily regulators and bureaucrats, but certainly digital activists and journalists, can understand better what the algorithms are selecting for, what the social media companies know about the effect of the algorithms on tweaking our attention and captivating us and getting us to engage, and therefore how we might be able to use the free market and the values of small L liberalism and capitalism to counteract those impediments, and maybe, yes, even to regulate them. And maybe we should have panels of wise experts. I know that this sends a chill up libertarian spines, but there are areas like of public health where in Australia or in any country where you have socialized medicine and difficult decisions have to be made about the value of certain drugs or certain procedures over another, and you're not necessarily going to spend $20 million on a life-saving procedure, because to do so for one person would be to jeopardize the lives of 100 other people who could avail themselves of a procedure that is 100 times cheaper. All those kinds of calculations are going on in the background all the time. Insurance companies are putting values on lives. We do have a need for experts on boards to look at things and assess the risk rewards of them. And without wanting to wade into the territory of selecting for or against good or bad ideas, I do think that the people, through regulators and governments, should be able to select for or against good or bad algorithms, good or bad sort of meta conversations about how we have conversations. So the point that I basically want to make, and that I wanted to make on the television show and subsequently did make in pared down form in the Sydney Morning Herald. By the way, I'll put a link to the article in the Sydney Morning Herald in the show notes, so go and click on that. I think it is paywalled, but I might ask them to unpaywall it, so take a look. The other thing that was published this week that you might be interested in was a big feature profile of me in the Weekend Australian. The Weekend Australian is the big national broadsheet. Having a profile there is something of a nice and flattering thing. It's sort of like being profiled in the New York Times magazine on the Sunday New York Times or something like that. And I think they did a good job at encapsulating what I'm trying to be up to and what I'm trying to do. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well for your reading pleasure later on. But the point that I was basically trying to make there was we don't want to get into a game of whack-a-mole where we're empowering regulators and e-safety commissioners and basically censors to decide what ideas are good and what ideas are bad. But it's perfectly legitimate for us to wield our democratic power to decide the ways in which social media companies tweak what they regard as being good or bad or worthy of showing us or not worthy of showing us. If that sounds like maybe a dangerous distinction or a slippery slope, let me give an example, because this is the example that just came up, the UK race riots, right? Many of the powerful people in the UK who want to protect us all from offensive speech are using these race riots as a justification for criminalizing incitement. Well, actually, incitement is already criminal, but expanding the definition of what constitutes incitement. As we just heard in my exchange on television there, I believe that incitement means tomorrow at 3 p.m, let's all gather in Piccadilly Circus and bash some heads in, and then you go and do that. Then in hindsight, that tweet was incitement. To say civil war is coming, and by the way, the e-safety commissioner then also, if you listen carefully, implies that Elon said, get out there and riot or something, which he did not say. She may be confusing something that he tweeted in the past about San Francisco or something, but anyway, she's putting words in his mouth in terms of that particular quote. What he said was civil war is inevitable. Now, Jonathan Freedland in the Guardian, one of the Guardian's most prized left-wing columnists and most respected columnists in the UK, wrote a piece about this entitled, "You know who else should be on trial for the UK's far-right riots? Elon Musk." Subtitled, "Direct guilt sits with those who brought violence to our streets, but their hatred was inflamed by lies spread on X." Similarly, another gentleman named Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's former communications director, and he's a man whose dissembling and misinformation helped kill 1 million Iraqis. He is now a popular, jocular left-wing figure. He hosts this wildly popular podcast in the UK called The Rest is Politics. He co-hosts it. And he posted to Twitter a video of Douglas Murray, my journalist friend, conservative provocateur, warning that exactly this kind of race violence would happen and really bemoaning the fact that it is happening. Take a look at the video clip that Alistair Campbell shared of Douglas Murray.
We have seen recently with things like the atrocity of this terrible young man who went and stabbed these young girls who were at the Taylor Swift dance class.
The little girls.
Just beyond belief. And the public mood is febrile. And there have been demonstrations and things that, we do not see often in Britain. Burning of police stations by very angry mobs. I just see today, a Muslim group, sort of doing a boundary policing thing in their area of chanting Allahu Akbar and defend the mosque. The worst thing for me is exactly what I said would happen. And the reason I wrote The Strange Death of Europe and the reason I banged on about this for years beforehand was I said it is so obvious what is going to happen. I was so angry watching it when it could have been stopped.
Yeah, it sucks to be right about something so bad.
And I should emphasize, if you're listening to the podcast version of this, you can see all of these if you go to the YouTube channel. Many people aren't even aware that we have a YouTube channel. It's only reasonably recent, and it doesn't have very many followers. So do us a solid and go and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want to pull that out, and you can see my beautiful visage at the same time. Nonetheless, so Alistair Campbell sends out this tweet, and he says that London's Metropolitan Police Service, and he tags them in this tweet, should take a look at Douglas Murray. And Alistair Campbell's 1.1 million followers pile on. If you don't understand quite how Orwellian that is, then you don't understand the status of free speech in the UK at the moment, which is basically that the UK doesn't have any. It does, of course, with limits, but everywhere has free speech with limits. Vladimir Putin claims that Russia has free speech too, according to Vladimir Putin. It just doesn't have free speech towards people who question the integrity of the good men and women on the Russian side who are fighting in Ukraine, as my colleague Marsha Gessen found out in July when they were sentenced in absentia by a Russian court to 8 years in prison for questioning Russia's military lies in Ukraine and military campaign, war in Ukraine. Russia claims to have free speech, but, there are limits to free speech. We hear people say, of course, everyone claims to want free speech. Supporting free speech is like supporting kittens and rainbows. Who would say that they're not for free speech? The devil's in the details. The devil is in where you say, as the E-Safety Commissioner did sitting right next to me on television and on the television panel, of course we support free speech, but, and what matters is what comes after the but you can't use free speech to denigrate or incite or offend traditionally disadvantaged minorities, the national good, the common good of the people. Insert the thing that you care about at the moment, or rather that the elite majority opinion cares about right now. And that's the thing that free speech should not trample on. It's a trick as tired and old as Stalin's moustache. So England's Director of Public Prosecutions is quite aggressive about speech that's bad on Twitter. Of course, he doesn't say that he's against speech that's bad on Twitter. What he says is, well, let's quote him directly, shall we? He boasts that you can be arrested in England for tweeting something which, quote, is insulting or abusive, which is intended to or likely to start racial hatred. Okay, insulting. Insulting according to whom? Recently, the London Metropolitan Police prevented a Londoner who was dressed in a business suit, wearing a yarmulke on his head, a kippah, a Jewish skullcap, from crossing the street in London during a Gaza protest under threat of arrest because his quote-unquote openly Jewish appearance was considered a provocation to the crowd. Right? Does that fall under the Director of Public Prosecution's a definition of insulting or offensive or inciting, does it? So the police who can't control a mob of angry anti-Zionists and prevent them from being violent are threatening with arrest a person wearing a yarmulke because that's a provocation, that's incitement to the mob. Concurrently, bobbies, your friendly English cops, show up at the doors of people's houses in the UK to arrest them or threaten them with arrest for posting things on social media that are inciting or offensive or racially demeaning. The British government itself literally posts on Twitter, like seemingly without any kind of sense of Orwellian irony about this, a warning, and I quote, "Think before you post." And underneath the tweet it says, "Content that incites violence or hatred isn't just harmful, it can be illegal." Thank you very much. I mean, that must come as a great consolation to the victims of the roughly 2.3 million crimes that go unsolved in the UK each year to know that Britain's dedicated police force are scouring the internet to make sure that Nana can no longer misgender people on Facebook. Not all heroes wear capes. Good for them. So this brings us back to Douglas Murray. Douglas and I have a lot of disagreements. I mean, I disagree with Douglas about a lot. I think he has huge blind spots on the question of, Palestinian statehood. I think his tone can sometimes be overly aggressive when it comes to immigration and the integration of minority communities. There's a lot that we disagree about. I think he is, insanely cavalier about the downsides of the threat that Trump poses to American democracy. But I've traveled with the man. I've had many dinners with the man. I've shared many stages with the man. And a world in which that man is guilty of a crime for being as articulate and really perspicacious as he's been and insightful and prescient as he's been is extraordinary. I mean, it is extraordinary to think that Tony Blair's former communications director, who's complicit in selling the British people and the world misinformation that led to, at a minimum, hundreds of thousands of deaths, that man thinks it's appropriate to not just denigrate, but criminally implicate one of his rivals for being prescient about the underlying causes of racial violence is absolutely extraordinary in 2024, is chilling in 2024, and is something that in 1984 we would have hoped that we'd gotten over by 2024. But these are stressful times, and these are trying times, and the algorithms and the social medias are deranging everybody a little bit, and one easy response to that is to think that bad people should just stop saying bad things on the interwebs. And when they do, we should tag the police in tweets and encourage them to take a look at them. Now, I should just note that I too wrestle with the question of how much just asking questions does one need to do before you're no longer just asking questions, but you're actually pushing a sinister barrow, right? How much banging on does Nigel Farage have to do about, the people just won't stand for this level of immigration? A lot of people are expressing to me their concerns before you go, well, hang on, are a lot of people expressing to you these concerns? Or are you just concerned? Are you just using that as a fudge? As a broadcaster myself, I know the hoary old trick of saying, a lot of people are saying that blah, blah, blah. No, a lot of people aren't saying that, or if they are, that's not the relevant point. The point is that you want to ask that question or you want to make that statement. It's a sleight of hand. So I don't know, I'm not saying that there is no there when someone feels discomfort about a person like Douglas Murray making such hay for so long about the demographic anxiety that will be churned up by Britain's rates of immigration and its failure to integrate its migrant communities, in particular Muslim minorities. I appreciate that it can sound unseemly and can sound a bit xenophobic and that it sounds like a bit of a cheat for people who are banging on about this to say, look, I'm just asking questions and I'm merely prognosticating. I'm just saying what might happen. There's some line between that and incitement to violence. There would come a point at which you would be talking in such a way that you are actually stirring up the very feelings that you say that you're merely reporting upon. However, what I know for sure is that wherever that line is, it is not a line that I want a government bureaucrat deciding for me or for you or for Douglas Murray, with the threat of throwing him in jail or somehow other punishing him for having transgressed this imaginary line between merely warning about civil war or racial violence and inciting it. Let's just look at the background to all this, because if you're not familiar with Britain's rates of immigration, you might just think, well, I don't quite understand what they're all banging on about. So I hadn't realized until I researched this, and unfortunately I wasn't able to include some of these statistics in my article for time considerations. But listen to this. Up until 1994, the UK basically had no immigration. In fact, in most years, they had net emigration. So, where if you balance the number of people coming in, the number of people going out, their population was actually shrinking in terms of exits and entries. That all changed in 1994 with a new policy. But even up into the late 90s, you had sort of about maybe 40,000, 60,000 people arriving in Britain every year. By 2012, immigration had gone from zero 15, 20 years beforehand to 160,000 a year. That was in 2012. By last year, it was almost 700,000. So it's gone from zero or negative up to 160,000 in 2012 to almost 700,000 last year, and it was over 700,000 the year before that. The undocumented arrivals by boat alone, just people arriving, I don't want to say illegally because technically you are allowed to arrive unannounced and seek asylum, but let's just say illegally because they could have sought asylum in France. They're coming from France, right? The people who arrive on boat into the UK. The people who are arriving illegally by boat across the English Channel, 40,000 a year. Now that is about the same number as the total number of net migrants who came into the UK in 1997. So think about how that feels if you're a Brit, right? This is a leap of imagination for an Australian or even an American, but especially an Australian because more than half of our population has arrived since the Second World War. So we're a much more multi-ethnic country, and nobody here was around for very long unless you're a First Nations Australian. But in the UK, people were. People were here for a long time. And if you're a 40-year-old person in the UK, then when you were 13 years old, the total number of legal migrants was the same as merely the number of illegal people arriving by boat today. The total number of legal migrants was the same as just the number arriving by boat. And the current number of legal migrants is 15 times what it was when you were a teenager, if you're 40 in the UK. Now, it would be one thing if this immigration level was associated with an aggressive government policy to integrate communities and to get people living around their neighbourhoods with traditionally British people, so there was some capacity to learn English and to integrate at the same schools and to form bonds and friendships between communities and between individuals. But what has happened in the UK to an extent that it hasn't happened in the US and Australia is that you've established essentially little fiefdoms of different nationalities. I spoke recently with the Australian High Commissioner, the former Australian High Commissioner to the UK. That's just a fancy name for the ambassador. For some reason, between Commonwealth countries, ambassadors are called High Commissioners. So he was the Australian ambassador to the UK. It's a very interesting episode, actually. It's an episode of this podcast that you should listen to, in which he also happens to be the diplomat who instigated the Mueller investigation into Donald Trump, because he was the guy who George Papadopoulos, that Trump aide, mentioned over drinks in London that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton. And then Alexander Downer, this former Australian foreign minister and former Australian ambassador to London, tipped off the FBI that he'd just had this odd conversation, and the FBI interviewed him, and that began Russiagate. Nonetheless, that's a really interesting episode as well. But he knows something about British society, British culture. And I interviewed him, and he wrote in the Australian newspaper that you now have entire English suburbs which are Bengali. You have whole villages that are Polish. You have whole council areas that are Kashmiri. I personally quite like that. Like, I quite like it because I find it interesting. I find it unusual. I'm a bit of a xenophile. I'm a rootless, cosmopolitan, globalist, elitist who likes swanning around the world and eating interesting foods and bumping into interesting different communities. But if I was a traditionalist, just living in my English suburb, and it had gone from being basically the same demography as it had had for centuries, and then in the past decade or two had just completely changed overnight, and all of the signs were now in Kashmiri, well, yeah, I might find that a little bit disconcerting. And if then when people tried to talk about that and raise questions about that, or express some kind of demographic anxiety about that, they were called racists. And if a bipartisan consensus was imposed between all political parties that immigration rates were going to remain high and flows of people from the European Union and from the continent were going to remain uncontrolled, essentially, and there wasn't really anything you could do because to complain about it was to be a bit of a xenophobic tabloid-reading Nazi, then of course you're creating conditions in which racial violence can flourish because racial resentment is not being addressed. This is not to say, do we need to really do the whole throat-clearing thing where, I make the point that, of course, the violence is still the fault of the people who are being violent, and that there is no excuse for violence, and there is no excuse for racial violence in particular, and there is no excuse for burning down shops, blah, blah, blah. Of course, don't be in a mob and don't be violent. That goes without saying. But it shouldn't also go without saying that there has been an elite consensus about the things that you're supposed to talk about in Britain that has sidelined any real or honest bullshit-free conversation about this particular issue, and that has exacerbated the tensions that gave rise to the race riots. So into this fray blunders the great Elon Musk with this tweet that I argued with the Safety Commissioner about. Civil war is inevitable. Okay, I understand how she sees that as incitement. But let me ask this. Suppose civil war were inevitable, just hypothetically, would there be any way to warn about it on Twitter that Australia's e-Safety Commissioner would not regard as incitement? How would you say it? How would you warn about a dire future consequence without being guilty of instigating or inciting or inflaming the possibility of that future negative consequence coming to pass? Like, the rule seems to be, if you warn about something that implicates the elites in having caused it, if you say there will be racial civil war because the elites have been ignoring the voice of the people on the integration and pace of immigration, then that is incitement. And you can presumably be prosecuted or at least kicked off social media for saying that. Even if it were true, one would imagine. This is bonkers. Like, you have to be able to Because I don't think the claim is merely that it's not true that civil war is inevitable. That's not the claim of the people who think that it's incitement. Like, it's no justification to say, well, hang on, I correctly predicted race riots. No, Alistair Campbell is still going to want to see Douglas Murray locked up for the correct prognostication. It's the prognostication itself. It's the statement of openly announcing what you see in front of your own eyes that they regard as the crime, because they don't want to take responsibility for having any involvement in the violence in the first place through the policies that they've supported and imposed, and the speech codes that they've supported and imposed. On Monday of last week, at the time of recording, the British government announced that it is reclassifying misogyny as a form of extremism, which will make it more easy to prosecute under these anti-incitement, anti-offensive speech, anti-insulting, denigrating, being a mean person laws. It's funny that I actually saw this news on the scroll. I saw this banner on the news, on the television news, while I was at the airport catching my flight to go to be on Q&A in Melbourne. So it was highly apropos, because it made me think, so whose version of misogyny prevails then when you're prosecuting misogyny? Is it misogynistic to insist that biological males who identify as women should compete in all-female sporting events? Some feminists say it is, and other activists say that those feminists are TERFs. And in fact, in the pre-Elon Musk era of Twitter, people were kicked off Twitter and had their accounts suspended or banned for tweeting things like, women aren't men. This is a point I made on Q&A.
Platforms make decisions about content every single day, thousands of decisions. And that is, to use a sort of an overused metaphor, somewhat black boxed. And surely wouldn't you say, Josh, that transparency over all those decisions platforms make about speech is a win for freedom of speech?
It's the first thing that I said, yeah. I mean, that I think there should be radical transparency over the algorithm.
But I think you're misconstruing
that
how this
right
happens,
today.
though.
Remember that.
And we have transparency powers that we've used to great effect, that no other country has been able to expose what companies are and are not doing with their algorithms around sextortion, around child sexual abuse material, around online hate. And yes, there are definitions that the Parliament develops for us. I enforce the laws. But do you think this should be a free-for-all, that there shouldn't be any safety net for children who are being mercilessly
For children, yeah, look, this is nuanced. So, it's a case-by-case basis.
But you're saying we shouldn't do it on a case-by-case basis.
Well, no. The issue is a case-by-case. You shouldn't be prosecuting people on a case-by-case basis on the basis of what they post. I was just at the airport.
It isn't on a basis of what they post. It's on a basis of what they report to us.
Under the previous regime at Twitter, before Elon Musk, there were people who were suspended on Twitter for posting men aren't women. That's an idea that is involved in the trans debate, for example, that was considered to be hate speech. There are all kinds of things that you can say about immigration, race, multiculturalism, transgender, sex, that some people will regard as being hate speech.
They're saying it now, aren't they?
So if we're going to start getting enthusiastic about banning people from saying offensive or insulting things, we'd better be bloody certain that we know exactly, and we all agree on what is offensive and what is insulting. Is it offensive to say that importing 500,000 people into Australia every year puts pressure on property prices? Because that's something that the opposition leader of Australia said when announcing a policy to a planned, proposal to reduce immigration in Australia. And after he said it, one of Australia's most prominent journalists said that anyone who says that is racist, or rather that he's being racist for pointing out that importing 500,000 people every year might put upward pressure on property prices. Well, is it offensive to say what he said, or is it offensive to say that someone who says that is racist? I could see a case either way. Is it offensive to say that Zionists are killing Palestinian babies, or is it offensive to say that Gazans elected a jihadist death cult? Is it offensive to say that masculinity is toxic, or is it offensive to say that #not all men are violent? Is it offensive to say that Islam oppresses women? Or is it offensive to say that women should submit to Islam? the simple answer is all of those things are offensive to somebody, and which one is deemed offensive enough to get you punished by the state is going to depend on who holds the reins of power. Back in the 1950s, arguing for communism got you criminally sanctioned. In the First World War, arguing for pacifism got you criminally sanctioned. In the 1960s, marching with the Black Panthers got you criminally sanctioned. Every era has its elite majority consensus. And inside the elite majority consensus, it does not appear to be a consensus. It appears to be the truth. It appears to be what's right. It appears to be what's just. I always pull out this old, gag. It's not even a gag. I suppose it's some kind of a metaphor or a parable about the two young fish swimming through the ocean. I'm sure you've heard it before if you're a regular listener. And an older fish swims past them and says, "How's the water today, guys?" And as the old fish swims away, one of the young fish looks to the other one and goes, "What's water?" We don't know the water when we're inside it. It seems self-evident to the majority that the majority opinion is the correct one, and that ones that transgress it, ideas that transgress it, opinions that undermine the ability of the majority to enact its will, are somehow kind of contaminating. They're not just incorrect, they're actually bad, they're flawed, they're contrary to the common good. And so when I ask, who gets to say what's misogynistic, or who gets to say what's offensive, or who gets to say what's insulting, obviously that's a bit of a rhetorical trick, because we know who gets to decide. Who gets to decide are the elites who control things. Now, I'm not being like all kind of arm wavy and kind of Russell Brandy here about elites controlling the world. I'm talking about a group of people, which includes myself, who are a largely university educated, kind of left-wing clique of middle-class, mostly white, kind of colonially guilty social justice types. Now, obviously, because I'm inside that group, I find myself questioning it a lot because I'm a contrarian. But as you'll note, I don't spend all of my time on the Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro right banging on about wokeness. I only bang on about it as much as is absolutely necessary. So, at the moment, the elite that is getting to decide what's offensive and what's not offensive is an elite that the elite, by definition, likes because it's them. So all the bad things, the things that code as bad are things like, hate against transgender people, or being against immigration, or being unseemly towards migrants, or not being sufficiently on board with gay rights. These are all the things that code as impure. But it is entirely possible that there will be a populist right-wing uprising in the UK or in Australia. It's possible we will get our Donald Trump. It's possible we will get our Giorgia Meloni. It's possible we will get our Marine Le Pen. This has happened in Italy already. It almost happened in France. Brexit happened. Trump happened. It is the height of arrogance to assume that the elite that is currently deciding what is appropriate speech and what is not appropriate speech, what is insulting and what is offensive and what isn't, is going to be in power in perpetuity, even if our conclusions were correct. I mean, there are two levels of arrogance going on here. One is the kind of epistemological arrogance that we have finally settled on the correct ideas and we are the first people in the history of the world to correctly distinguish between ideas that are good and ones that are hateful, offensive, inciting, or insulting. Obviously, in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, people are going to look back on our norms and our taboos and think that many of them were misguided. Every single past civilization of people have always thought that they had finally settled on what was right and wrong as well. It's highly unlikely that we're the ones who finally nailed it. So there's that level of arrogance. But then even if it were the case that we had nailed it, there's an extra level of arrogance in thinking that we're going to be able to retain our censorious reins of power indefinitely. Decide what rules you want people in power to abide by, and then stick by those bloody rules. Don't try to have a bob each way and say I wouldn't want right-wingers to be enforcing their idea of what hate speech is, but I do want to enforce mine because mine is right. Even if yours were right, you're not going to be in power for the rest of time, you bloody idiot. You know, you can fully imagine a populist right-wing government deciding that hate speech or offensive speech or insulting speech is, in a Viktor Orban-y type way, speech that denigrates the history of this great country, or a Vladimir Putin-y way, if you want to. You know, history claims that undermine the sanctity of the family, claims that call into question the nobility of the Australian historical experience, meaning the white Australian historical experience. You can absolutely imagine them saying that anyone who peddles a black armband view of history and focuses too much on the injustices towards First Nations people is undermining the Australian common good. You can spin it a million ways from Sunday. You can imagine that whatever clique is in power is going to impose their version of what is impure and what needs to be excised from the public square. Don't play that game. The censoriousness and arm-waving snowflake ability of the left is precisely what gives the populist right its power. So even if it weren't the case that it is morally and strategically wise to err on the side of free speech, it would just be tactically savvy to do so, because that way you actually drain the right of much of its power, you know, much of the appeal of the right to people who are winnable. I know there are a lot of people on the left who just think that the populist right are all just a bunch of fascist Nazis who were born that way, and they're kind of, you know, they don't even require any further explanation. It's just a prima facie situation of white supremacists are going to be white supremacists, so we just have to fight them. Well, how's that working out so far? You know, what is actually happening is that there is an extremification dynamic where the hysteria of the left is goosing the hysteria of the right, and people who are in the middle, who are otherwise winnable, see the crazies on both sides, and, you know, the best way to win them over and the best way to create a quorum of sane people who can defend what I call the radical center is to be radically centrist and to be sense-making and to be, I suppose, morally empathic towards other people and have the moral imagination to understand your own fallibility and to show a bit of humility. That's the way to attract people. You know, if the left can be the bigger party, then it deprives the right of a fair bit of oxygen, tactically speaking. So the final point I would just make is, when we're talking about incitement, we're talking about offense, just remember, we're talking about ideas. Unless we're saying, meet me at 3 p.m. tomorrow, you know, in this time and place, in order to do this, we're talking about ideas, right? Multiculturalism is an idea. Immigration is an idea. Biological males being women is an idea. Zionism is an idea. Palestinian statehood is an idea. Men and women being equally suited to being corporate CEOs or childcare workers or oil rig engineers is an idea, right? Like, if I'm physically violent, then lock me up, but do not dare use the state's monopoly on the force of violence to punish me for criticizing or proposing an idea. If you make it hazardous for reasonable people to discuss controversial ideas, then only unreasonable people will discuss those ideas. If you say it's racist to discuss the integration of migrants, only racists will discuss it. To solve the challenges of the 21st century, from artificial intelligence to climate chaos to the threats to liberal democracy, we need the widest possible public square. We need the most rambunctious possible terrain. We need the widest scope of conversation. We need a population that feels heard, that doesn't feel like it's being betrayed by elites, that doesn't feel like taboos are being imposed by an elite consensus that isn't listening to them. We need a proper public square that is not sullied by either algorithms or by bureaucrats. I disagree with Elon Musk and I disagree with Douglas Murray about a lot, but in an open society, the disagreement is the point. Take care. I'll see you next week.